Stop the engine! Hands where I can see them! Now!
Officer, please, someone is dying. I'm taking them to the hospital. Every second matters!
Step out of the vehicle, you're not going anywhere!
The scream of metal was the overture. A 4-car pileup on Interstate 10, just east of the city limits, had turned the afternoon commute into a scrapyard of shattered glass and crumpled steel. The Arizona sun beat down, indifferent, baking the asphalt and making the air shimmer over the wreckage. Amid the chaos of sirens and shouting, there was a bubble of intense, focused silence. It was centered on Dr. Aris Thorne, who was on his knees beside an overturned sedan. His hands, steady and sure, moved with an economy born of a decade in the country's busiest trauma centers and 2 tours as a combat surgeon in Kandahar. His patient, a man in his late 40s named Marcus, was pinned behind the steering wheel, his chest crushed. Every ragged breath was a losing battle. The local fire department paramedics had done their job, stabilizing him as best they could, but they were out of their depth. This wasn't a transport case. This was a battlefield procedure needed right now. That's why they had called for the air ambulance, and Dr. Thorne had come with it. He wasn't just a flight physician. He was the head of surgical trauma at Phoenix General, a man who could rebuild a human body from the inside out. He had a reputation for performing miracles in situations where hope had already bled out. "He's going into tamponade," Aris said, his voice calm, cutting through the noise. He didn't look up from the patient's chest where he was performing a rapid ultrasound. "The pericardial sac is filling with blood. His heart is being crushed. We have to relieve the pressure now or he's dead in 5 minutes." The paramedic, a young woman named Chloe, nodded, her face pale but determined. She knew the term. Cardiac tamponade was a death sentence without immediate intervention. She handed him the pericardiocentesis kit. The procedure was delicate, dangerous, and rarely performed in the field. It involved inserting a massive needle into the chest, through the ribs, and into the sac around the heart to drain the blood. A millimeter in the wrong direction, and the needle would puncture the heart itself, killing the patient instantly. Aris cleaned the insertion point with an alcohol swab. He took the long needle, his focus absolute. The world shrank to the space between his hands and his patient's chest. The wail of approaching sirens was just background noise. The shouts of firefighters using the jaws of life on a nearby car were a distant echo. There was only the patient, the needle, and the handful of seconds he had to save a life. That's when a shadow fell over him. "All right, clear the scene. I need everyone to step back. Now!" The voice was young, sharp, and laced with an unearned authority. Aris didn't look up. Every fiber of his being was concentrated on the needle's trajectory. "I'm a physician. This man is dying. I need you to give me space," he stated, his tone flat and professional. He couldn't afford to waste breath on anything else. "I said step back. You're contaminating a potential crime scene." The voice was closer now. Heavy boots crunched on the shattered safety glass. Aris paused, the needle hovering a centimeter from Marcus's chest. This was the critical moment. He glanced up, his eyes meeting those of a police officer. The man couldn't have been more than 30. His name tag read Keller. His hand was resting on his holstered firearm, a posture meant to intimidate. His expression was a mask of rigid control, the kind worn by men who mistake command for competence. "Officer, with all due respect, your crime scene will be a homicide scene in about 90 seconds if you don't let me do my job," Aris said, his voice still level but with an edge of steel. "This man's heart is being compressed. I am the only person here who can fix it. Now please, step away." Officer Keller did not step away. He stepped closer, his boots now inches from the sterile field Aris had laid out on the asphalt. "I don't know who you are. I'm securing this scene. That means everyone, including you. Stand up and move away from the vehicle." The demand was so fundamentally ignorant of the situation, so dangerously disconnected from the reality of the dying man at their feet, that for a fraction of a second Aris was speechless. He looked from the officer's unyielding face to Marcus's, which was now turning a dusky gray. The monitor beside him showed a blood pressure that was plummeting off a cliff. There was no more time for discussion. The choice was simple. obey an unlawful, lethal order, or uphold the oath he had taken to do no harm. It wasn't a choice at all. Ignoring the officer, Eris turned his full attention back to his patient. The time for words was over. Only action mattered now. "Chloe, keep pressure on that femoral bleed. We're doing this," he said, his voice a low, steady command that cut through the tension. He lowered the needle, his surgeon's grip precise, his mind calculating angles and depths with the speed of a supercomputer. He had performed this exact procedure under machine gun fire in a dusty village in Afghanistan. An arrogant cop on a stretch of Arizona highway was not going to stop him. "Did you hear me? I gave you a lawful order." Officer Keller's voice rose, cracking with indignation. He reached down, his hand closing around Eris's shoulder. The touch was a violation, not just of his person, but of the sacred space between a doctor and his dying patient. Eris flinched, not from the pressure, but from the sheer audacity of the interference. "Get your hand off me, officer," Eris said, his voice dangerously quiet. He did not look up. His eyes were fixed on the ultrasound screen, guiding the needle's tip through layers of tissue toward the blood-filled sac strangling Marcus's heart. "You are now actively interfering with life-saving medical care. That is a felony in this state. You are breaking the law, not me." The statement, delivered with such cold, factual certainty, seemed to momentarily stun Keller. His hand loosened. In that brief pause, Eris advanced the needle. He felt the subtle pop as it punctured the pericardial sac. Dark, non-clotting blood began to fill the attached syringe. On the monitor, the patient's blood pressure, which had been a catastrophic 60/30, immediately ticked up to 70/40. It was a small victory, but it was a victory. Marcus's life was still hanging by a thread, but the thread had just gotten a little stronger. "It's working," Chloe breathed, her eyes wide. "Pressure's coming up." Eris began to draw back more blood, his movements fluid and efficient. He needed to drain at least 50 cubic centimeters to make a real difference, but the reprieve was short-lived. Officer Keller, his authority challenged and his ego bruised, recovered quickly. He doubled down. "I don't care what you think the law is. I'm the law here. This is my scene. You will comply. I need to see your identification, right now." The demand was absurd. Eris was wearing surgical scrubs clearly marked with Phoenix General Trauma Surgery. His ID badge was clipped to his collar, his face and name clearly visible. The air ambulance helicopter, blades still slowly turning, was less than 50 yards away, its markings a clear declaration of their purpose. "My identification is right here," Eris said, nodding his head toward his badge. "And my hands are currently inside a man's chest cavity, preventing him from dying. You can read my name, call dispatch, and verify my credentials, but I am not stopping this procedure. This man's life takes precedence over your paperwork." He filled one syringe, passed it to Chloe to discard, and attached another. The blood pressure monitor beeped again, 85/50. They were pulling him back from the brink. The firefighters had now managed to pry the driver's side door open. A backboard was being slid into place. They were almost ready to extricate him. They just needed another minute. It was a minute Officer Keller was unwilling to give. "That's it. You're being willfully non-compliant. You think you're above the law because you're a doctor?" Keller's voice was tight with anger. He unclipped his handcuffs from his belt. The metallic rattle was a jarring, alien sound in the medical bubble Eris had created. Chloe gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The firefighters paused, their tools whining down as they stared in disbelief. For the first time, the surrounding chaos focused entirely on the confrontation unfolding over the critically injured man. Eris ignored it all. He was focused on the syringe, on the rhythm of the patient's heart, on the numbers climbing slowly, agonizingly back toward life. He had a duty, an oath that superseded any badge, any gun, any man's fragile pride, and he would not, could not, abandon it. The officer had made his decision. Now Eris had reaffirmed his. The two duties, one sworn to protect life and the other sworn to enforce order, were on a collision course, and the collision was about to become catastrophic. "Final warning, step away from the patient," Officer Keller commanded, his voice now flat and devoid of any reason. He held the open handcuffs in his hand. It was no longer a request or an order, it was a threat made manifest. Eris drew another 20 cubic centimeters of blood from the pericardial sac. The pressure was now 95/60. The patient was stabilizing. His skin color was improving from ashen gray to a pale white. They were winning. "We're extricating now," a firefighter captain called out, moving toward the car. "Doctor, give us the word." "Almost there," Eris replied, his focus unwavering. "Just need to secure the drain. Another 30 seconds. He could feel Officer Keller's presence looming over him, a storm of misplaced authority ready to break. He knew what was coming, but he couldn't stop. To stop now would be to condemn Marcus to death just as surely as if he'd plunged a knife into his chest himself. He reached for the medical tape to secure the catheter he'd leave in place for the transport. That's when Keller acted. He grabbed Eris's upper arm, this time with a grip of steel, and yanked. The force was jarring and violent. Eris was pulled backward, stumbling away from his patient. The syringe, still connected to the catheter in Marcus's chest, was ripped from his hand. The catheter itself was dislodged, pulling halfway out. "Patient is destabilizing!" Chloe yelled, her voice frantic as she pointed at the monitor. The blood pressure numbers began to tumble immediately. 90/55, 85/50, 80/45. The heart, once again being crushed by the refilling blood, was beginning to fail. "What are you doing?" the fire captain shouted, taking a step toward Keller. "He was saving his life!" But Keller was locked on his target. He spun Eris around, shoving him against the side of the wrecked sedan. The metal groaned under the impact. "You are under arrest for obstructing a police investigation and resisting arrest," Keller grunted, wrenching Eris's arms behind his back. Eris didn't resist physically, the shock of the assault giving way to a cold, horrifying realization of what had just happened. The life he had just pulled back from the edge was now slipping away again, all because of this officer's monumental ignorance and ego. The handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. The cold metal was a stark contrast to the warmth of the Arizona sun. The sound, a sharp, definitive click-clack, was captured by a dozen cell phone cameras that had suddenly materialized among the gawking drivers who had gotten out of their cars. It was the sound of a line being crossed, a line between duty and dereliction, a line between saving a life and destroying one. "My patient," Eris said, his voice strained, not with pain, but with a desperate urgency. "Officer, you are killing him." "The drain is dislodged. He's going back into tamponade." Keller ignored him. He patted Eris down with rough, perfunctory motions. "You should have thought of that before you decided to play hero and ignore a lawful command," he muttered, his breath hot against Eris's ear. Behind them, the scene had devolved into controlled panic. Chloe, the paramedic, was trying to re-access the chest wound, her hands shaking. The fire captain was on his radio, his voice a furious staccato, calling for another flight physician, reporting an officer interfering with medical aid. Marcus, the man at the center of it all, was groaning, his eyes fluttering open in agony before rolling back into his head. The monitor was screaming a shrill, continuous alarm as his blood pressure crashed. Keller pushed Eris toward his patrol car, a black and white parked haphazardly on the shoulder. As he was marched away from the patient he had sworn to protect, Eris saw the faces of the firefighters and paramedics. He saw their shock, their anger, and their helplessness. They knew what he knew, that every second a heart is deprived of its ability to beat is a second that brain cells die. Every moment wasted was a moment that stole from Marcus's future, chipping away at the man he might have been if he survived. The arrest wasn't just an injustice to a doctor. It was a potential death sentence for a patient, delivered by a man wearing a badge who had fundamentally failed to understand the meaning of the words "to protect" and "to serve." The patrol car door slammed shut, sealing Eris in a cage of heat and helplessness, the sound of the medical monitor's alarm growing fainter, more desperate with every passing second. The back of the patrol car was an oven, The vinyl seat stuck to Eris's scrubs as he sat, wrists bound tightly behind his back, watching the frantic scene unfold through the wire mesh cage. He could see the fire captain directing two of his men to assist Chloe. One was bagging the patient, forcing oxygen into his lungs, while the other was trying to apply pressure to the dislodged chest catheter, a futile gesture. Eris knew the only thing that would save Marcus was the reinsertion of that needle, a procedure none of them were trained or authorized to perform. They were doing their best, but their best was no longer enough. The window of opportunity Eris had created had been slammed shut by Officer Keller. Keller got into the driver's seat, the car rocking with his weight. He didn't start the engine. He picked up his radio microphone, his thumb pressing the button. "Dispatch, 7-David-4. I have one in custody, code 4 at the scene." His voice was calm, procedural, as if he had just handled a routine traffic stop and not actively sabotaged a critical medical intervention. The disconnect was staggering. Eris leaned forward as much as the handcuffs would allow. "Officer, you need to listen to me," he said, his voice urgent. "That man is having a pericardial tamponade. The delay you have caused is resulting in an anoxic brain injury. Every second you keep me in this car, you are personally and professionally liable for the permanent damage he is sustaining. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Keller glanced at him in the rearview mirror, his eyes cold and dismissive. "What I understand is that I have a non-compliant suspect in custody. You can tell your story to the sergeant at the station." He turned his attention back to the scene, a flicker of something, uncertainty perhaps, crossing his face for just a moment as he saw the escalating panic around the patient. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the same rigid mask of authority. He had made his move, and now he was committed to seeing it through. To back down now would be to admit he was wrong, and men like Keller never admitted they were wrong. The wail of another siren grew louder, and a second ambulance swerved to a stop behind the wreckage. Two new paramedics jumped out, running toward the patient with their own kit. Eris recognized the lead medic, a man named Ben Carter, one of the best in the city. Ben took one look at the scene, the chaotic CPR, Chloe's desperate expression, the fire captain's furious face, and then his eyes scanned the area, finally landing on the patrol car. He saw Eris in the back, in scrubs and handcuffs, and his jaw dropped. Confusion warred with dawning comprehension on his face. He knew Eris. They'd worked dozens of critical scenes together. Ben pointed at the patrol car, saying something to the fire captain, who just shook his head in disgust. The new team took over with practiced efficiency. Ben assessed the patient, his hands flying, shouting orders to his partner. They loaded Marcus onto a gurney, the chest compressions never stopping. It had been, Eris calculated with a sickening knot in his stomach, at least 6 minutes since he had been pulled away. 6 minutes of interrupted care. 6 minutes of the brain being starved of oxygen. 6 minutes that could mean the difference between a full recovery and a persistent vegetative state. It was an eternity in trauma medicine. As they rushed the gurney toward the new ambulance, Ben glanced one more time at the patrol car, his expression a mixture of fury and disbelief. He knew exactly what had happened here. He knew that the best trauma surgeon in the state was sitting in handcuffs while his patient's life slipped away. The ambulance doors slammed shut, and with a final, mournful chirp of its siren, it sped away, lights flashing, leaving a void in the chaotic tableau. Keller watched it go, then finally started the engine. "See? They handled it," he said. The words meant more for himself than for Eris. "No thanks to you." Eris just leaned his head back against the hot cage, a profound sense of failure washing over him. Not his own, but the system's. A system that had allowed an officer with a fragile ego to wield his authority with such catastrophic incompetence. The preventable consequences were now speeding toward the hospital, a human tragedy created by one man's need to be in charge. The drive to the downtown precinct was a study in tense silence. Officer Keller navigated traffic with an aggressive certainty that seemed to be his default mode, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Eris remained quiet, running through the physiological cascade happening inside Marcus's body. He calculated the likely extent of the brain damage, the probable cardiac complications, the long, brutal road of recovery Marcus faced, if he recovered at all. Each red light, each traffic jam felt like another shovelful of dirt on a grave. This wasn't just an arrest, it was a slow-motion catastrophe, and Eris was a helpless spectator. They pulled into the sallyport of the central precinct, a cavernous concrete garage that smelled of exhaust fumes and disinfectant. Keller led Eris out of the car, his hand firmly on his elbow, and guided him into the building. The booking area was a brightly lit, sterile space, all linoleum floors and cinder-block walls, humming with the low thrum of computers and radios. A few officers looked up from their desks, their curiosity piqued by the sight of a surgeon in blood-flecked scrubs being brought in handcuffs. Their expressions were a mixture of confusion and mild amusement. "Got a live one for you, Mike," Keller said to the booking sergeant, a heavy-set man with a weary face. "Obstruction of a governmental operation and resisting arrest." The booking sergeant looked Eris up and down, taking in the scrubs, the ID badge still clipped to his collar. He sighed, a sound that suggested this was already more complicated than he wanted it to be. "All right, let's get him processed. Empty your pockets." Eris couldn't, of course. "Officer, my hands are cuffed behind my back," he stated, his voice flat. Keller roughly spun him around and began pulling items from his pockets: a wallet, keys, a penlight, a trauma shear. He placed them in a gray plastic bin. The booking sergeant picked up the wallet, flipping it open to the driver's license and the hospital ID card nestled beside it. He read the name, then the title. Dr. Eris Thorne, Chief of Trauma Surgery, Phoenix General Hospital. The sergeant's eyebrows shot up. He looked from the ID to Eris's face, then to Keller. "Keller, you arrested Eris Thorne? The Eris Thorne?" The name clearly meant something here. Eris had worked with the police for years on gunshot cases, stabbings, and major accidents. He'd testified in court, consulted on cases. He wasn't a stranger to this building, but he'd never been on this side of the desk. "He was interfering with my accident investigation," Keller said defensively, his tone sharpening. "Refused to follow lawful orders." Before the sergeant could reply, a door opened and a woman in a captain's uniform emerged, holding a coffee mug. She had sharp eyes and a no-nonsense air that commanded respect. She stopped dead when she saw Eris. "Thorne? What in God's name is going on?" Captain Eva Rostova was a 25-year veteran of the force, a woman Eris had come to know and respect. She ran the homicide division and knew better than anyone the importance of the golden hour and the medical work that happened within it. "Captain," Eris said, nodding his head, "good to see you, Eva. Unfortunately, your officer here seems to have confused a medical procedure with a criminal act." Rostova's gaze shifted to Keller, and her expression hardened into granite. "Keller, my office, now," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "And someone get those damn cuffs off the doctor." Keller hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Captain, he was obstructing." "I didn't ask for a debate, officer. I gave you an order. Do it." There was no arguing with that tone. With a look of barely concealed resentment, Keller uncuffed Eris. The freedom of movement returned with a rush of pins and needles in his hands. He rubbed his wrists, the red marks from the steel already visible on his skin. Captain Rostova looked at the booking sergeant. "Hold all paperwork on this. Not another thing happens until I've spoken with him." She then fixed her gaze on Eris. "Doctor, I am so sorry. Come with me. We need to get your side of this." The unwelcome surprise of his identity had just landed on Keller's lap, and the institutional gears were beginning to grind in a direction he clearly had not anticipated. The catastrophic liability he had single-handedly created for the city was just beginning to come into focus. Captain Rostova's office was a small, cluttered space filled with commendations, case files, and the faint smell of stale coffee. It was a world away from the sterile precision of Eris's operating room, but it was a place of authority, and right now, that's what mattered. "Start from the beginning," Rostova said, gesturing for Eris to sit as she closed the door, shutting out the noise of the precinct. Officer Keller stood stiffly in the corner, his arms crossed, a thunderous expression on his face. Eris recounted the events with clinical precision: the patient's condition, the necessity of the field procedure, Keller's arrival and demands, the refusal to stop treatment, and the subsequent arrest and removal from the patient's side. As he spoke, Rostova's expression grew more and more grim. She looked from Eris to Keller, who shifted his weight, avoiding her gaze. "Keller, is this accurate?" she asked, her voice dangerously calm. "Did you physically remove a physician from a patient during a life-saving procedure?" "He was refusing to identify himself and secure the scene," Keller insisted, his defense sounding weaker with every repetition. "I was maintaining order." "Order?" Rostova shot back, her voice rising. "There was a man bleeding to death. His job is to fix that. Your job is to help him. You don't arrest the fire department for putting out a fire, do you? What in God's name were you thinking?" Before Keller could answer, Rostova's desk phone rang. She snatched it up. "Rostova, yes, he's here. I understand." She listened for a long moment, her face becoming a mask. "Understood. Keep me updated." She hung up the phone and looked at Eris, her eyes filled with a new level of concern. "That was the hospital's chief administrator. The patient, Marcus Thorne, no relation, I assume. He's out of surgery. He's alive." Eris felt a small wave of relief, but it was instantly tempered by Rostova's tone. "But," he prompted. "He coded on the table. Twice," Rostova said, her voice heavy. "They got him back, but he was without a stable heartbeat for too long. The neurosurgeon just finished the initial scans. There's significant hypoxic brain injury. They don't know the extent of the permanent damage yet, but it's severe. The surgeon's preliminary report explicitly states the delay in transport and the interruption of pre-hospital care are the direct contributing factors." The words hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. Severe, permanent brain damage. It was the outcome Eris had feared, the direct consequence of those stolen minutes. He felt a cold knot of anger tighten in his stomach. He looked at Keller, who now seemed to shrink slightly in his uniform, the color draining from his face. This was no longer about a wrongful arrest. This was about a life that had been irrevocably shattered. Just then, there was a firm knock on the door. A woman in a sharply tailored business suit entered without waiting for an invitation. She was in her 50s, with an aura of intense competence and zero patience for nonsense. "Captain Rostova," she said, her voice crisp. "I'm Evelyn Reed. I'm General Counsel for Phoenix General Hospital. I'm here for my client, Dr. Eris Thorne." Evelyn Reed was a legend in legal circles, a tenacious litigator who had defended the hospital against malpractice suits and government overreach for 20 years. Her arrival signaled that the situation had escalated from an internal police matter to a full-blown institutional crisis. She glanced at Eris, a flicker of concern in her eyes. "Eris, are you all right? Don't say another word." She then turned her steely gaze to Keller and then to Rostova. "Captain, my client was unlawfully arrested while performing his medical duties in direct violation of state and federal statutes protecting emergency responders. The patient in question has suffered catastrophic and likely permanent injuries as a direct result of this officer's actions. The hospital will be pursuing all available legal remedies. For now, I'm taking my client home." Her pronouncement was not a request. It was a statement of fact. Rostova, looking at the mountain of legal and financial trouble that had just landed on her department's doorstep, simply nodded. "He's free to go. There will be no charges filed." She looked at Keller, her expression one of utter contempt. "Officer Keller, you are on administrative leave, effective immediately. Hand over your badge and weapon. An internal affairs investigation is being opened as we speak." The ticking clock on the consequences of Keller's decision had just struck midnight, and the fallout was only beginning. Walking out of the police precinct into the late afternoon sun felt surreal. Just an hour earlier, Eris had been brought in like a common criminal. Now he was walking out with the hospital's top lawyer, while the officer who arrested him was being stripped of his authority. It was a dizzying reversal, but it brought him no satisfaction. The news about Marcus Thorne's condition had extinguished any sense of personal victory. His own temporary loss of freedom was nothing compared to the permanent prison of cognitive impairment that Marcus might now be confined to for the rest of his life. "They know how bad this is," Evelyn Reed said, her voice low as they walked toward her car. "A captain doesn't override a street arrest and suspend an officer on the spot unless she sees a multi-million-dollar lawsuit walking out the door." "It's not about the money, Evelyn," Eris said, his voice rough. "They almost let a man die on the highway because an officer couldn't handle being told no. What about the next time? The next paramedic or doctor who's in that position?" "I know," she said, unlocking her car. "And that's why it is about the money. Money, and the public shaming that comes with it, is the only language a city bureaucracy truly understands. It's the only thing that forces real systemic change. And trust me, Eris, we are going to make them change." They drove to the hospital in silence. Eris's mind was a whirlwind. He replayed the incident over and over, searching for anything he could have done differently. Should he have been more deferential? Tried to explain more slowly? But there had been no time. Marcus's heart was failing. Every second spent arguing was a second stolen from the patient. He had made the only choice a doctor could make. The consequences of that choice were now a problem for lawyers and administrators, but the moral calculus remained clear and unshakable in his mind. At the hospital, the atmosphere was tense. Word had spread like wildfire. Nurses and doctors in the emergency department stopped and stared as Eris walked through, his scrub still dirty and wrinkled from the arrest. Their expressions weren't of pity, but of a grim, shared understanding. Any one of them could have been in his place. He went straight to the surgical ICU. He found Marcus Thorne's family huddled in a small waiting room, their faces etched with fear and confusion. A hospital liaison was speaking to a woman Eris assumed was Marcus's wife. When she saw Eris, she stood up. "Are you Dr. Thorne, the one who was with him on the road?" "Yes," Eris said gently. "I am. I am so sorry for what happened." He spent the next hour explaining everything, not the legal details of the arrest, but the medical facts. He explained the cardiac tamponade, the procedure he had started, the interruption, and the resulting delay. He was honest about the severity of the brain injury, not offering false hope, but assuring them that Marcus was receiving the best care in the world. The family listened, their grief mixed with a dawning anger not at him, but at the circumstances. "So he would be okay if that police officer hadn't stopped you?" Marcus's wife asked, her voice trembling. Eris hesitated. In medicine, nothing was certain. But in this case, the line between cause and effect was terrifyingly clear. "The interruption of care," he said carefully, "was the primary factor in his neurological decline. I believe his chances for a near-full recovery would have been excellent had we been able to complete the procedure and transport him without delay." That was all she needed to hear. The tears she had been holding back finally came, silent and agonizing. Eris stayed with them until they had no more questions, feeling the immense weight of a life irrevocably altered. This was the true cost. Not the potential lawsuit, not the officer's career, but this family's shattered world. He left them with the on-call neurosurgeon and went to his office. He felt exhausted, not physically, but emotionally. He had won his freedom, but it was a conditional, hollow victory. The real fight, the one for Marcus Thorne and for every first responder who would face a similar choice, had just begun. The resolve hardened within him. This could not and would not be swept under the rug. This demanded more than an apology or a quiet settlement. It demanded a reckoning. Within 48 hours, the incident had become a local firestorm. News outlets, tipped off by witnesses with cell phone footage, ran the story with sensational headlines. "Top surgeon arrested while saving man's life." The grainy videos showed Officer Keller yanking a man in scrubs away from an injured patient, the sharp click of the handcuffs audible over the din of the highway. The Phoenix Police Department issued a terse statement about an ongoing internal affairs investigation, but the damage was done. Public opinion was swift and overwhelmingly on Eris's side. But Eris and Evelyn Reed were focused on a different battle, one that would be fought not in the court of public opinion, but in a federal courthouse. They met in a large conference room at Evelyn's law firm, the table covered with files, reports, and witness statements. "The city will want to settle this quickly and quietly," Evelyn said, tapping a pen on a legal pad. "They'll offer you a personal settlement, maybe a few $100,000 for the false arrest, an apology, and they'll promise to retrain the officer. We can't accept that." "I have no intention of accepting it," Eris replied firmly. "This is not about me. This is about the principle. What Keller did was a symptom of a systemic problem, a culture where a police officer's authority is seen as absolute, even when it directly contradicts a medical professional's duty to save a life." "Exactly," Evelyn said, a sharp smile on her lips. "So we're not filing a simple false arrest claim. We're going bigger. We're filing a federal civil rights lawsuit under Section 1983. We'll argue that the city's failure to properly train and supervise its officers on interacting with emergency medical personnel constitutes a deliberate indifference to the constitutional rights of its citizens, in this case, Marcus Thorne's right to life, and your right to practice your profession without unlawful interference." It was an ambitious legal strategy. It wasn't just suing Officer Keller for his actions, it was indicting the entire police department for its policies, or lack thereof. It aimed not just for compensation, but for court-mandated systemic reform. The lawsuit was drafted over the next week, a meticulously detailed document that read like a medical chart of a broken system. It named Officer Dean Keller and the city of Phoenix as defendants. It laid out the timeline of the incident to the second, supported by paramedic logs and dispatch records. It included a detailed medical explanation of cardiac tamponade and the catastrophic effects of delayed treatment. Most powerfully, it detailed the human cost. Marcus Thorne, a 48-year-old architect and father of two, who had now been moved from the ICU to a long-term care facility, able to breathe on his own but otherwise unresponsive, his life and his family's future destroyed. The damages sought were staggering. $15.8 million. The number wasn't arbitrary. It was calculated based on Marcus's lifetime of lost earnings, the immense cost of his round-the-clock medical care, and punitive damages designed to be so significant that the city would have no choice but to take notice. When the suit was filed, the number made headlines across the country. It was a statement. It said that the cost of allowing police ego to override medical necessity was not just a tragedy, but an obscene financial liability that taxpayers would have to bear. The city's legal department was stunned. They had expected a personal injury claim, a wrongful arrest suit. They had not expected a federal case that put their entire training protocol on trial. Their initial response was dismissive, a public statement claiming that Officer Keller had acted within the bounds of his training and department policy. It was a disastrous misstep. In one sentence, they had publicly admitted that their policy allowed for an officer to interfere with a life-saving medical procedure. Evelyn Reed's office immediately released a counterstatement. "We thank the city for confirming the central argument of our case, that their policies are fatally flawed and in desperate need of federal oversight." The battle lines were drawn. This was no longer just about one doctor and one police officer on a stretch of highway. It was a fight for the principle that a medical oath sometimes had to stand up to a badge, and it was a fight Eris and Evelyn were determined to win, no matter how long it took. The legal process moved from the press to the painstaking work of discovery. Evelyn Reed's team filed subpoenas for everything: Officer Keller's personnel file, training records, every complaint ever filed against him, and most importantly, the full, unedited footage from his body camera. The city's lawyers tried to stonewall, citing privacy concerns and ongoing internal investigations, but a federal judge, unimpressed with their arguments, ordered them to turn everything over within 30 days. When the files arrived, they painted a telling picture. Officer Dean Keller, in his 6 years on the force, had accumulated 12 citizen complaints. 8 of them were for abuse of authority or unprofessional conduct. While none had resulted in formal discipline beyond a written reprimand, they established a clear pattern of behavior. A young officer with a confrontational style who consistently escalated minor situations and reacted poorly when his authority was questioned. He was a lawsuit waiting to happen, and on that sunny afternoon on I-10, he had finally happened. But the centerpiece of the discovery was the body camera footage. Evelyn and Aris watched it for the first time on a large monitor in the law firm's conference room. The video was shaky and visceral, the audio clear and damning. It began with Keller arriving at the chaotic scene. The unblinking eye of the camera captured exactly what he saw: the mangled cars, the firefighters working, and the small, focused medical team on the ground. Crucially, it showed that before ever speaking to Aris, Keller's camera panned over the scene, clearly capturing Aris's scrubs with "trauma surgery" printed on the back, and the air ambulance helicopter nearby. It proved he knew, or should have known, he was dealing with a high-level medical professional at a critical incident. Then came the audio. "All right, clear the scene. I need everyone to step back. Now!" Keller's voice was sharp, impatient. The camera angle tilted down, showing Aris on his knees, his hands working on the patient. The viewer could hear Aris's calm, clipped response. "I'm a physician. This man is dying. I need you to give me space." The contrast between Keller's escalating aggression and Aris's professional focus was stark. The footage recorded every word of the exchange, every warning Aris gave. "Officer, you are now actively interfering with life-saving medical care. That is a felony in this state." The camera captured Keller's hand reaching out and grabbing Aris's shoulder. It captured the moment the needle was dislodged, the immediate cry of the paramedic, "Patient is destabilizing!" Most damningly, the camera captured the aftermath of the arrest. While Keller was cuffing Aris, the camera was pointed directly at the patient. The viewer could see the firefighters and the paramedics scrambling, their actions growing more frantic. The audio picked up the shrill, continuous alarm of the heart monitor, a soundtrack to a preventable tragedy. The camera kept rolling as Keller marched Aris to the patrol car, a journey that felt like an eternity. It recorded Aris's desperate plea from the back seat, "Officer, you are killing him!" And it recorded Keller's chillingly dismissive reply, "You should have thought of that before you decided to play hero." When the video ended, the conference room was silent. Evelyn Reed clicked off the monitor. "Well," she said, her voice tight with controlled fury, "that's the case. Right there. Any competent jury in the country will see that for what it is, a catastrophic abuse of power that directly led to a man's permanent disability." The body camera, a tool intended to ensure police accountability, had done its job with terrifying clarity. It had captured not just the events, but the intent behind them. It showed an officer who was not trying to secure a scene or investigate a crime, but was fixated on asserting his dominance over a situation he did not understand and was unwilling to learn about. The unblinking eye of the camera had seen everything, and it was about to show it all to the world. The city's defense, already weak, had just been fatally wounded. The deposition of Officer Dean Keller was held 6 months after the incident. It took place in a sterile, windowless room at a neutral law firm, a far cry from the sun-baked chaos of the highway. Keller arrived flanked by 2 attorneys from the city's legal department and a police union representative. He wore a crisp suit, his hair neatly cut, a stark contrast to the uniformed officer on the body cam footage. He looked confident, almost defiant, but there was a tightness around his eyes that betrayed the pressure he was under. Aris was also present, sitting quietly next to Evelyn Reed. He was there not as a witness, but as the plaintiff, a silent observer to the deconstruction of the man who had arrested him. Evelyn Reed began her questioning in a calm, almost conversational tone. She had him confirm his name, his badge number, his years on the force. She walked him through his training, establishing that he had received basic instruction on interacting with other first responders at emergency scenes. Then, she moved to the day of the crash. "Officer Keller, when you arrived on scene, what was your primary objective?" she asked. "To secure the scene," render aid, and begin the accident investigation, Keller recited, the answer clearly rehearsed. And in what order of priority? Evelyn pressed. Keller hesitated. They are all priorities. Let's be specific, Evelyn said, her voice sharpening slightly. Is preserving a potential crime scene more important than rendering aid to a critically injured person? The city attorney objected. Calls for speculation. But Evelyn simply rephrased. What does your department protocol say, officer? Life safety is the #1 priority at any incident scene, is it not? Yes, Keller conceded. Life safety is the priority. Good. We agree, Evelyn said, making a note. Now, when you approached Dr. Thorne, the body camera footage shows you were aware he was a medical professional actively treating a patient. You saw his scrubs, the ambulance, the medical equipment. Is that correct? I saw a person who was not complying with my orders to clear the scene, Keller countered. But you knew he was providing medical care. I'm not a doctor. I couldn't verify what he was doing. This was the core of his defense, feigned ignorance. Evelyn was ready for it. You're not a doctor, that's correct. But Dr. Thorne, a board-certified trauma surgeon, told you, did he not, that the patient was dying and that he was performing a life-saving procedure? He said that, yes. And a paramedic on scene confirmed the patient was destabilizing when you interfered, did she not? I heard her say something, yes. So, Evelyn leaned forward, her voice dropping to a precise, cutting tone. You, a man with no medical training, chose to disregard the expert assessment of 2 medical professionals at a critical scene and substitute your own judgment that your need for him to step back was more important than the patient's life. The city attorney objected again, but the question hung in the air. Keller stammered, I was maintaining control of the scene. He was being uncooperative. Uncooperative in what way? Evelyn shot back. By saving a man's life? Is that what the Phoenix PD considers non-compliance? Did he threaten you? Did he assault you? Or did he simply refuse to abandon his patient to show you an ID you could have easily read from his collar? For 7 hours, she dismantled him. She used the body camera footage, playing short clips and forcing him to explain his actions second by second. She used his own department's protocols against him, showing how he had violated the core tenet of prioritizing life safety. She used his history of citizen complaints to show that this wasn't an isolated mistake, but a pattern of behavior. Under the relentless, precise pressure of her questions, Keller's confident facade crumbled. His answers became clipped, defensive, and contradictory. He was exposed not as an officer making a tough call in a chaotic situation, but as a man whose ego could not tolerate being challenged. He had seen a professional who did not immediately bow to his authority, and his only response was to escalate until he could impose his will through force. The deposition transcript was a devastating indictment. It wasn't just evidence of a mistake, it was a confession, however unintentional, of a catastrophic failure in judgment, temperament, and basic human decency. The city's case was now in ruins, and everyone in that room knew it. The day after Officer Keller's disastrous deposition, Evelyn Reed's phone rang. It was the lead attorney for the city of Phoenix. The confident, dismissive tone from the early days of the lawsuit was gone, replaced by a weary pragmatism. Evelyn, he began, I think it's time we had a serious discussion about resolving this matter. Evelyn had been expecting the call. The deposition transcript read like a script for a plaintiff's victory. It was a roadmap of every mistake Keller had made, narrated by the man himself. I'm always open to a serious discussion, Mark, she replied, her voice neutral. They proposed a meeting. The city's initial offer came a week later. They offered a settlement of $2.5 million. It was a substantial amount of money, an admission of significant wrongdoing. The offer was twofold. $500,000 to Aris for the civil rights violation of his false arrest, and $2 million to be placed in a trust for Marcus Thorne's lifelong care. They also offered a formal public apology to Dr. Thorne and a commitment to review their training protocols. They think this is about making it go away, Evelyn told Eris as they reviewed the offer in her office. They think money will solve this. It's a good offer. From a purely financial standpoint, it would guarantee Marcus's care. Eris looked out the window at the city skyline. He thought of Marcus Thorne, lying in a hospital bed, his mind a prisoner in his own body. He thought of Marcus's wife and children, their lives shattered. Then he thought of the next paramedic, the next ER nurse, the next doctor who would be in his shoes, facing an officer who believed his badge gave him the right to make medical decisions. $2.5 million is the cost of doing business for them, Eris said, turning back to Evelyn. They'll pay it, the story will fade, and nothing will fundamentally change. The policies will be reviewed, which means a memo will be sent out that everyone ignores. Keller might get suspended for a few months and then quietly reinstated. No, it's not enough. Evelyn smiled. It was the answer she had expected and hoped for. So what do we tell them? We tell them no, Eris said, his voice firm. This isn't just about compensating Marcus for the life that was stolen from him. This is about ensuring this never happens again. We want the full amount of the lawsuit, the $15.8 million, to send a message that a citizen's life is not a rounding error in the city budget. And we don't want a review of their policies. We want court-mandated, independently monitored systemic reform. We want new laws. We want Keller fired. And we want that body camera footage to become required viewing for every police recruit in this state. His demands were audacious. He wasn't just asking for a settlement, he was demanding the city's surrender. When Evelyn relayed their counter-proposal to the city's attorneys, there was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. They had viewed the $2.5 million as a generous offer to make the problem vanish. They were now faced with a plaintiff who wasn't interested in personal enrichment, but in forcing a complete institutional overhaul. The city's gambit to settle the case quietly had failed spectacularly. Their refusal to accept the initial offer transformed the nature of the negotiation. The city's lawyers knew that going to trial was now an existential threat. A jury would see the body camera footage. They would hear from the neurosurgeons who treated Marcus. They would read the deposition of Officer Keller. The potential verdict could be even higher than the $15.8 million Eris was demanding. More importantly, a public trial would expose the department's failures on a national stage, a PR catastrophe they couldn't afford. Eris and Evelyn had them backed into a corner. By refusing the easy money, they had forced the city to confront the true cost of its officers' actions, a cost that would have to be paid not just in dollars, but in real, lasting change. The leverage had shifted entirely in their favor, and they were prepared to use it. With the settlement talks stalled at the vast gulf between the city's offer and Eris's demands, both sides agreed to non-binding mediation. It was a last-ditch effort to avoid a costly and unpredictable public trial. The mediator was a retired federal judge named Lawrence Caldwell, a man with a reputation for his sharp intellect and his intolerance for legal posturing. He had read every file, every deposition, and had watched the body camera footage 3 times. The mediation took place in the same neutral law office as the deposition. Judge Caldwell sat at the head of a long mahogany table. On one side sat Evelyn and Eris. On the other, the city's legal team, now bolstered by 2 senior city managers responsible for risk assessment. The morning was spent with each side presenting their case. The city's lawyers argued that while Officer Keller may have made a mistake in a chaotic environment, it was an isolated incident, not indicative of a systemic failure. They argued that the $15.8 million demand was excessive and punitive. Then it was Evelyn's turn. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't use inflammatory language. She simply, methodically, laid out the facts. She played key snippets of the body camera footage. She presented the medical reports, highlighting the direct causal link between the delay and Marcus Thorne's brain injury. She read aloud the most damning excerpts from Officer Keller's deposition, his own words convicting him of recklessness and ego. She concluded with a presentation on the projected lifetime cost of Marcus's medical care, a figure that, on its own, exceeded $10 million. "This isn't punitive," she finished, looking directly at Judge Caldwell. "This is simple math. This is the cost of what was taken, and the policy changes we demand are the price of ensuring it never happens again." After both sides had spoken, Judge Caldwell called for a recess. He met with each side separately in private caucuses. When he met with the city's team, his bluntness was legendary. "Let me be clear," he told them, his voice leaving no room for argument. "If this case goes to trial, you will lose. There is not a jury in this country that will watch that video and side with your officer. They will see a hero in scrubs trying to save a life and a bully with a badge who stopped him. Your officer's deposition is a complete disaster. He comes across as arrogant and incompetent." He let that sink in before continuing. "Ms. Reed's demand is not excessive. It's realistic. The cost of care for the victim is astronomical. The negligence is clear and egregious. A jury will be angry, and angry juries award punitive damages that will make your hair stand on end. I estimate your trial exposure is north of $20 million, plus your own legal fees, plus the public humiliation. You are not in a negotiating position. You are in a damage control position." He looked at the risk managers. "I advise you to call the mayor. You need to settle this today. This is the best deal you are ever going to get." When the parties reconvened, the atmosphere had changed. The city's lawyers were pale. After a series of hushed phone calls, they came back to the table. They capitulated. The final settlement was for the full $15.8 million. $12 million would be placed into a court-administered trust for the lifelong care of Marcus Thorne. $3.8 million would be awarded to Dr. Thorne for the violation of his civil rights and to cover legal fees. But the financial component was only part of the victory. The settlement was contingent on the city agreeing to a consent decree, a legally binding agreement overseen by the federal court. This decree mandated a complete overhaul of the Phoenix Police Department's protocols for interacting with emergency medical personnel. It required new, mandatory annual training, co-developed with medical professionals, focusing on de-escalation and recognizing the primacy of medical care at incident scenes. It established a new rule that any arrest of a credentialed first responder in the act of providing patient care would trigger an automatic, independent investigation by an outside agency. It was everything Eris had demanded. It was a landmark victory, not just for him and for Marcus Thorne, but for every first responder who had ever been bullied or obstructed by law enforcement. The final tally wasn't just measured in dollars, it was measured in the promise of a safer future. The announcement of the $15.8 million settlement sent shockwaves through the city and the national law enforcement community. It was one of the largest pre-trial settlements for a police misconduct case in the state's history. The number itself was a headline, a stark admission of catastrophic failure. While the city's official statement was filled with carefully worded legalese about avoiding the costs of protracted litigation, everyone understood it for what it was, a complete surrender. For Officer Dean Keller, the settlement was the final nail in the coffin of his career. The internal affairs investigation, which had been proceeding slowly, was suddenly expedited. With the city now on the hook for a massive payout, there was no longer any political will to protect him. His police union provided a lawyer, but there was little to defend. The body camera footage and his deposition testimony were irrefutable. His attempts to justify his actions as maintaining scene security were dismissed as self-serving and contrary to all accepted police practices. The IA report was scathing. It found him guilty of multiple policy violations, abuse of authority, conduct unbecoming of an officer, and, most seriously, gross negligence endangering the life of a citizen. The report detailed his history of prior complaints, arguing that the department had missed the warning signs of an officer with poor judgment and an inability to de-escalate conflict. It concluded that his actions on the I-10 were not a reasonable mistake made in a stressful situation, but a willful and reckless disregard for a human life, motivated by a personal need to assert dominance. The police chief, facing immense pressure from the mayor's office and an outraged public, had no choice. 3 weeks after the settlement was finalized, Dean Keller was terminated from the Phoenix Police Department. His dismissal was made public, a rare move designed to show the city was taking the matter seriously. The termination letter was leaked to the press, its language uncompromising. It spoke of the public trust, the sacred duty to protect life, and how Keller's actions had brought shame upon the badge and the dedicated officers who wear it with honor. Keller's career, the one he had pursued with such rigid and misguided zeal, was over at the age of 31. He was stripped of his badge, his authority, and the identity that had clearly meant so much to him. He became a pariah within the law enforcement community, a cautionary tale of how ego and a lack of humility could lead to ruin. His name was added to the National Decertification Index, ensuring he could never work as a police officer in any other state. For Aris, there was no joy in seeing another man's life ruined. He saw it as a sad but necessary consequence. Keller's termination wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. It sent a clear and unambiguous message to every other officer on the force. There are limits to your authority. There are lines that cannot be crossed. Interfering with emergency medical care is one of them, and the consequences for doing so are no longer just a reprimand in a file, but the end of your career. The price of Keller's mistake was measured in millions of dollars for the city, but the personal price for him was the loss of everything he had worked for. It was a steep price, but it paled in comparison to the price Marcus Thorne and his family were paying every single day. The revocation of the badge was not an end to the story, but the beginning of its most important chapter, ensuring the change that had been paid for in blood and treasure would actually take root. With the legal battle concluded, Aris Thorne found himself in an unfamiliar position. The $3.8 million awarded to him was a staggering sum of money he had never sought. After his legal team was paid, he was left with a personal fortune, but he had no interest in a new house, a luxury car, or an early retirement. The money felt less like a reward and more like a responsibility. It was a tool, forged in tragedy, that could be used to prevent similar tragedies from ever happening again. After consulting with Evelyn Reed and leaders in the emergency medical community, he made a decision. He took a significant portion of the settlement, $2 million, and used it to establish a non-profit foundation, the Thorne Initiative for Responder Protection. The foundation's mission was twofold: to provide immediate legal support for first responders who faced retaliation or unlawful interference while performing their duties, and to fund the development and implementation of new collaborative training programs for police, fire, and EMS departments across the country. The initiative became Aris's passion project, the constructive answer to the destructive events on the highway. He hired a small staff, including a retired paramedic chief and a civil rights attorney, to run the day-to-day operations. The legal aid arm of the foundation was its most immediate and impactful work. They set up a national hotline. The calls started coming in almost immediately. A paramedic in a rural county being threatened with insubordination charges for refusing to let a police officer take a blood sample from an unconscious DUI suspect without a warrant. An EMT in a major city being disciplined after contradicting an officer's on-scene assessment of a domestic violence victim's injuries. A firefighter facing a write-up for blocking a traffic lane against an officer's orders to protect a patient from being struck by passing cars. These were the kinds of incidents that had previously been handled with a quiet reprimand, or had forced the responder to back down. Now, they had somewhere to turn. The Thorne Initiative provided pro bono legal advice, connected them with experienced local attorneys, and, if necessary, funded their legal defense. More often than not, a single, sharply worded letter from one of the initiative's lawyers, citing the Phoenix settlement as precedent, was enough to make the issue disappear. It gave a voice to those who had felt voiceless, backup for those who had felt alone on the front lines. The second arm of the foundation focused on prevention. Aris and his team worked with medical and law enforcement experts to create a new curriculum called Cross-Discipline Scene Management. It was a hands-on training program that put police recruits and paramedic students in the same high-stress simulation scenarios. They learned each other's terminology, command structures, and most importantly, legal and ethical priorities. The goal was to build mutual respect and understanding before they met over a dying patient on a dark highway. The program emphasized communication and de-escalation, teaching officers how to get the information they needed without obstructing care, and teaching medics how to assert their medical authority clearly and professionally. The Thorn Initiative was a force for change, funded by the consequences of one man's failure. It was Aris's way of honoring Marcus Thorn, transforming the tragedy of his ruined life into a shield that would protect countless others. The money from the settlement wasn't just a payment for damages, it became an investment in a safer, more collaborative future for emergency services, ensuring that the next time a doctor or paramedic said, "This person is dying," the response would be, "How can I help?" and not the click of handcuffs. The impact of the Phoenix settlement and the termination of Officer Keller radiated outward, far beyond the city limits. The case became a national talking point, a case study in police reform, civil rights, and the complex interplay of different emergency services. The body camera footage, once a key piece of evidence, took on a new life. With Aris's permission, the Thorn Initiative made an edited, anonymized version of it available for training purposes. It became one of the most requested and analyzed videos in police academies and paramedic schools across the United States. Instructors would pause the video at critical moments. What could Keller have done differently here? They would ask police recruits. How else could Dr. Thorn have communicated the urgency? They'd ask medical students. The footage was a powerful, real-world example of what not to do. It was a lesson in humility, situational awareness, and the catastrophic consequences of letting ego drive decision-making. It forced a difficult but necessary conversation in thousands of classrooms, changing the mindset of a new generation of first responders before they ever hit the streets. But the most significant and lasting ripple effect happened in the halls of the Arizona State Legislature. Spurred by public outcry and intense lobbying from a coalition of firefighter, paramedic, and nursing unions, all supported by the Thorn Initiative, a bipartisan group of lawmakers introduced a new bill. It was officially titled the Emergency Responder Protection Act, but everyone at the Capitol knew it by its unofficial name, Thorn's Law. The bill did what the settlement's consent decree did for Phoenix, but for the entire state. It explicitly codified into state law that in a medical emergency, the senior-most medical provider on scene has legal authority over patient care decisions. It made it a specific felony offense for any person, including a law enforcement officer, to intentionally obstruct or interfere with the rendering of emergency medical services. It also provided robust whistleblower protections for any first responder who reported such interference. The legislative hearings were emotionally charged. Aris testified not as a surgeon, but as a citizen, calmly recounting the events and the devastating outcome for Marcus Thorn. But the most powerful testimony came from Marcus's wife, Sarah. She took the witness stand, her voice shaking but firm, and told the lawmakers about the man her husband had been, a vibrant architect, a loving father, an amateur astronomer. She described her current reality, visiting him every day in a long-term care facility, speaking to him without ever knowing if he understood, watching their children grow up without their father's guidance. "My husband is a good man whose life was destroyed because of a power struggle that should never have happened," she said, her words silencing the room. "The person trying to save him was arrested for doing his job. How can that be possible?" I ask you to pass this law so that no other family has to endure what my family has endured, so that the next time the focus is only on saving a life." Her testimony was unanswerable. The bill passed both houses of the legislature with nearly unanimous support. The governor signed it into law in a public ceremony on the Capitol steps. He handed the ceremonial pen not to the politicians who sponsored the bill, but to Dr. Eris Thorne. The passage of Thorne's law in Arizona created a blueprint. Similar legislation began to be introduced in other states: Colorado, Texas, Florida, California. Each bill cited the Phoenix case as its catalyst. The story of one doctor's refusal to stand down on a highway had become a national movement, a ripple effect that was fundamentally changing the legal landscape for first responders, creating a clearer, brighter line between the duty to heal and the power to obstruct. One man's stand had become a law that would protect thousands. Years passed. The city of Phoenix implemented the reforms mandated by the consent decree. The Thorne Initiative grew into a respected national organization. Thorne's law became the model for legislation in more than a dozen states. The world, in measurable ways, became a safer place for first responders and their patients. But for the people at the heart of the story, the scars remained. Marcus Thorne never recovered. He lived in a state of minimal consciousness, his care funded by the trust the settlement had created. His family's life was a testament to love and endurance, but it was a life lived in the shadow of a great and permanent loss. His empty chair at the dinner table, the silenced workshop in his garage, the futures he would never see, these were the quiet daily costs of those few minutes of ego on a hot asphalt highway. He was the silent, constant reminder of the human price of a bad decision. Dr. Eris Thorne never stopped being a surgeon. He returned to the grueling 24-hour shifts, the controlled chaos of the trauma bay, the intense focus of the operating room. That was his calling. But something inside him had changed. He was more patient, perhaps, but also less tolerant of institutional arrogance. He carried the weight of what happened, not as a burden, but as a purpose. The incident had given him a second mission, one that extended beyond the sterile field of the OR. He became a reluctant but powerful advocate, speaking at conferences, testifying before legislative committees, and guiding the work of his foundation. He was still saving lives, one patient at a time with his scalpel, and thousands at a time with the legacy he had been forced to build. He still occasionally felt a spike of anxiety when a police car would pull up to one of his scenes. A part of him would always be on that highway, feeling the grip on his arm, hearing the click of the handcuffs. It was a trauma of its own kind, a scar on his professional soul. But he would see the officers behave differently now. They would ask, "Doc, what do you need?" They would create a perimeter, manage traffic, and support the medical effort. They had seen the video. They had been through the training. The culture, slowly, painfully, was shifting. And in those moments, Eris would feel a quiet sense of validation. The fight had been worth it. The price had been paid, but the change was real. The story of Eris Thorne and Dean Keller became a modern parable, a lesson taught in multiple professions about authority, duty, and the moment when they collide. It was a story about how the actions of one person, rooted in a simple, sworn oath to do no harm, could expose a systemic weakness and, through immense pressure and personal resolve, force it to heal. The legacy wasn't the money or the fame he never wanted. It was in the quiet confidence of a young paramedic who could now cite a specific law when asserting her medical authority. It was in the saved life of a car crash victim who was treated without interruption. It was in the silent, empty space where a future tragedy, like the one that befell Marcus Thorne, might have happened but now would not. One man's stand had created a shield for countless others who came after him. When we look back at that moment on the highway, it's easy to focus on the confrontation. But the real story began long before that. It began in a police culture that sometimes values absolute compliance over critical thinking. For Officer Keller, a young man likely driven by a desire for order in a chaotic world, that culture became a trap. His training probably taught him that control of a scene was paramount, and his ego couldn't differentiate between a non-compliant criminal and a doctor performing his duty. What if he had been trained not just to command, but to listen? What if his first instinct had been to ask, "How can I help you secure the patient?" instead of, "Show me your ID." That single shift in perspective, from assertion to cooperation, would have saved a man's life from ruin. And what of Dr. Thorne? Could he have done anything differently? Perhaps. If he'd had a large, reflective physician placard on his back, maybe it would have registered sooner with Keller. If he had taken 2 seconds to say, "Officer, I will comply in 60 seconds, but this man's heart is stopped," perhaps the different phrasing would have pierced the armor of authority. But in the heat of the moment, with a life on the line, he did what his entire being was trained to do. He focused on the patient. The lesson for all first responders is that while your primary duty is to the patient, documenting everything, communicating clearly, and knowing the specific laws that protect you are what allow you to survive the aftermath when things go wrong. The story of Aris Thorne isn't just about a lawsuit. It's a profound reminder that true authority isn't granted by a badge or a title, but earned through competence, humility, and a commitment to a purpose greater than oneself. It teaches us that challenging an unjust order isn't an act of defiance, but an act of profound responsibility. The system isn't perfect, but sometimes it takes one person's unwavering stand on principle to force it, grinding and groaning toward justice. What do you think is the most important lesson from this story? Have you ever witnessed a situation where two sets of professional duties came into conflict? Let us know in the comments below. Your engagement helps us continue to bring these important stories to light.